In mid-December 1944, the Western Front entered a phase that Allied commanders did not expect. After months of steady advances across France and into Belgium, American forces believed German offensive capability in the West had been largely exhausted. That assumption ended on the morning of 16th of December 1944, when German forces launched a large-scale counter-offensive through the Ardennes forest. The German operation was designated Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, translated as Watch on the Rhine. Its objective was to drive west through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse River, seize Antwerp, and split British and American forces. German leadership intended the operation to force a political crisis among the Allies and potentially compel a negotiated settlement. The offensive relied on speed, surprise, and the concentration of armored formations against lightly defended sectors. The Ardennes was selected because Allied units there were thinly spread. Terrain restricted large-scale observation, and winter weather limited Allied air power. One of the primary spearheads assigned to this offensive was a mobile armored battle group known as Kampfgruppe Peiper. This formation was drawn from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, an elite Waffen-SS unit with extensive combat experience on both the eastern and western fronts. The division was part of the 6th SS Panzer Army, commanded by Sepp Dietrich. Kampfgruppe Peiper was commanded by Joachim Peiper, an SS Obersturmbannführer who had previously served as a senior aide to Heinrich Himmler before returning to frontline command. Peiper had gained a reputation for aggressive leadership and rapid armored movement, particularly on the Eastern Front. The mission assigned to Peiper's force was explicit. His units were to advance rapidly along designated road networks, bypass resistance where possible, and maintain momentum toward the Meuse River. Speed was prioritized over securing flanks or rear areas. Delays were to be avoided. Fuel depots captured along the route were critical as German fuel supplies were limited. On the Allied side, American units in the Ardennes included a mixture of infantry, armor, artillery, and support formations. Many were understrength or newly arrived. The sector south of Malmedy was held by elements of the U.S. First Army, including non-combat and support units operating near forward areas due to the fluid nature of the front. One such unit was the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. The battalion's role was to provide artillery spotting and fire direction, not to engage in direct combat. Its personnel were lightly armed and often moved along road networks between observation posts, command points, and rear installations. By the early hours of 17th of December 1944, Kampfgruppe Peiper had already penetrated deep into American lines. German armored columns advanced westward through villages and crossroads, engaging U.S. units encountered along the way. Several small American formations were overrun or forced to withdraw. Reports of German armor moving rapidly through the sector reached higher headquarters, but the scale and speed of the penetration were still unclear. Weather conditions played a decisive role. Heavy cloud cover, snow, and fog grounded most Allied aircraft, limiting reconnaissance and air attack. Roads were icy, narrow, and congested with military traffic. Communications between American units were often disrupted as German forces cut telephone lines and bypassed command posts. During the morning of 17th December, elements of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion were ordered to move eastward toward the front to establish observation positions. The battalion traveled in a column of vehicles, including jeeps and trucks, along roads near the village of Baugnez, a crossroads located approximately 4 miles southeast of the town of Malmedy in Belgium. At the same time, advance elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper were moving through the same road network. German armored units, including tanks and half-tracks, approached the Baugnez crossroads from the east and southeast. The encounter between the two forces occurred around midday. The American column was not prepared for engagement with armored forces. When German units appeared, the Americans attempted to deploy, but were quickly surrounded. German troops established control over the crossroads and halted American movement. With limited weapons and no effective means of resistance, the American soldiers were forced to surrender. The surrender took place in an open field near the crossroads. American personnel were disarmed and gathered under guard. Accounts from survivors and later investigations established that the prisoners included enlisted men and officers, most from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, along with a small number of soldiers from other units who had joined the column. At this stage, the situation remained consistent with numerous other battlefield captures that occurred during the Ardennes fighting. German forces frequently took prisoners as they advanced, particularly when encountering isolated or support units. There was no immediate indication that events at Baugnez would diverge from established practice. Kampfgruppe Peiper continued to face pressure to move westward. The battle group's timetable was already slipping due to traffic congestion, resistance at roadblocks, and difficulties securing fuel. Prisoners represented a logistical burden. Guarding and evacuating them slowed movement and diverted manpower. Shortly after the surrender, events escalated. Gunfire broke out among the assembled American prisoners. German machine guns and small arms were used against the unarmed group. The firing continued for several minutes. American soldiers attempted to flee across the open field, while others were struck where they stood or lay. When the shooting stopped, dozens of American soldiers lay dead or wounded in the snow. Some survived by feigning death. Others escaped by running from the field despite being fired upon. These survivors would later reach American lines and provide the first reports of what had occurred at the Baugnez crossroads. The incident would become known as the Malmedy massacre, named after the nearby town, rather than the precise location of the killings. Initial reports were fragmented, but as American forces stabilized the front and recovered the area weeks later, physical evidence confirmed survivor accounts. Bodies were found in the field where the prisoners had been held. Many showed gunshot wounds consistent with close-range fire. No evidence indicated that the American prisoners had attempted to resist or escape prior to the shooting. The killings at Baugnez would become one of the most extensively investigated war crimes involving U.S. prisoners on the Western Front. Evidence collected in the weeks and months following the incident formed the basis for post-war prosecutions against members of Kampfgruppe Peiper and the 1st SS Panzer Division. At the time of the incident, however, none of that lay ahead. On 17 December 1944, the Ardennes front remained in chaos. German armored columns continued westward. American units scrambled to contain the breakthrough. News of the shooting spread through survivor testimony, creating immediate alarm among U.S. forces operating in the region. The events at Baugnez occurred within the first 48 hours of the German offensive, at a moment when command structures on both sides were strained, communications were disrupted, and the outcome of the battle remained uncertain. What followed at the crossroads south of Malmedy would shape not only the conduct of the Ardennes campaign, but also one of the most significant war crimes cases of the Second World War in Western Europe. On 17 December 1944, the second day of the German Ardennes offensive, movement along the road network south of Malmedy intensified. German armored columns from the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler continued pushing westward under orders to maintain momentum and avoid delays. At the same time, American units in the sector attempted to reposition amid fragmentary reports of German breakthroughs. During the morning hours, elements of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, a U.S. Army unit assigned to artillery spotting and fire direction, were ordered to move eastward. The battalion's personnel were not an infantry formation and were not equipped or trained for sustained combat against armored forces. Their vehicles included jeeps and trucks, and their individual weapons were limited primarily to rifles and pistols. The battalion column departed from the vicinity of Malmedy and proceeded along roads leading toward the front. Weather conditions were poor, snow covered the ground, temperatures were below freezing, and visibility was reduced by low cloud cover and intermittent fog. Roads were narrow and icy, increasing congestion and limiting maneuverability. At approximately midday, the American column approached the Baugnez crossroads, a junction where several roads converged roughly 4 miles southeast of Malmedy. The crossroads sat in open terrain bordered by fields, with limited natural cover. Control of this junction was tactically important because it provided access routes toward Ligneville, Stavelot, and Malmedy. At the same time, advance elements of Kampfgruppe Peiper, commanded by Joachim Peiper, were moving through the same area. German forces approaching the crossroads included armored vehicles, half-tracks, and infantry riding on or following the armored column. Their route had already brought them into contact with American units earlier in the day, resulting in several short engagements and bypassed positions. When German vehicles came into view at Baugnez, the American column was caught in an exposed position. The Germans quickly deployed to secure the crossroads. Tanks and armored vehicles took up positions that dominated the road approaches, while infantry moved to control the surrounding area. American personnel attempted to respond, but the imbalance was immediate. The 285th Battalion lacked anti-tank weapons and had no prepared defensive positions. The sudden appearance of German armor left little opportunity for organized resistance. Some American vehicles attempted to turn or reposition, but movement was constrained by the road layout and the speed of the German advance. Within a short period, German forces had effectively surrounded the American column. German soldiers ordered the Americans to halt and dismount. Facing overwhelming force, and with no realistic prospect of escape or effective resistance, American officers ordered their men to surrender. The surrender occurred in the open near the crossroads. American soldiers laid down their weapons and gathered under German guard. Accounts later collected from survivors and witnesses indicate that the prisoners were assembled in a field adjacent to the road, where they were visible to German personnel and vehicles passing through the junction. The group of prisoners consisted primarily of men from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, but also included a small number of soldiers from other U.S. units who had joined the column during earlier movements. The total number of prisoners taken at Baugnez was later estimated to be more than 80. German guards were assigned to the prisoners, while Kampfgruppe Peiper continued preparations to move westward. The battle group was operating under strict time constraints. Fuel shortages, traffic congestion, and resistance encountered at other points along the route had already slowed progress. Securing prisoners created an additional burden, requiring manpower and time that Peiper's force could ill afford. While the prisoners were being held, German vehicles continued to pass through the crossroads. Tanks and half-tracks moved westward, and additional German troops arrived and departed as the column advanced. The American prisoners remained in the field under guard, exposed to the cold and snow. Witness accounts differ on the precise sequence of events that followed, but several points are consistent across survivor testimony and later investigations. At some point after the surrender, gunfire erupted in the vicinity of the prisoners. German machine guns and small arms were used against the assembled Americans. The firing was sudden and sustained. Prisoners were struck while standing in the field. Others fell to the ground as shots were fired. Some attempted to flee across the open terrain toward nearby woods or ditches. German personnel fired at fleeing prisoners, and several were killed while attempting to escape. The shooting lasted several minutes. When it ended, numerous American soldiers lay dead or wounded in the snow-covered field. Those who survived did so by escaping the area or by remaining motionless among the bodies until German forces departed. There is no evidence that the American prisoners attempted to resist, attack their guards, or break custody prior to the opening of fire. Investigations conducted after the area was retaken by U.S. forces found no indications of weapons among the prisoners at the site, consistent with their status as disarmed captives. After the shooting, Kampfgruppe Peiper continued its westward movement. German forces did not remain at the site to provide medical assistance or to evacuate the wounded. The area remained under German control for a period, preventing immediate recovery of the bodies. Survivors who escaped from the field moved through wooded areas and ravines to avoid German patrols. Several reached American lines later that day, or in the days that followed. Their accounts provided the first reports of the killings to U.S. commanders. Initial reports described a mass killing of surrendered American soldiers near Malmedy. As these reports circulated, they contributed to heightened alarm among U.S. units in the Ardennes. Orders were issued emphasizing caution, and rumors of German atrocities spread rapidly through the ranks. In January 1945, after American forces pushed back the German advance and regained control of the Baugnez area, U.S. Army personnel returned to the site. Bodies were recovered from the field where the prisoners had been held. The dead were identified as American soldiers captured earlier on 17th of December. Medical examinations and battlefield investigations documented gunshot wounds consistent with execution-style firing at close and medium range. The evidence corroborated survivor testimony regarding the sequence of events following the surrender. The encounter at Baugnez, beginning with a routine battlefield capture and ending with the killing of prisoners, became a central element of what would later be known as the Malmedy Massacre. The location, timing, and participants were established through witness statements, physical evidence, and German records examined after the war. At the time of the encounter, however, the broader battle remained unresolved. German forces continued advancing westward, and American commanders focused on containing the breakthrough. The killings at Baugnez would not be fully investigated until weeks later, once the front stabilized and access to the site was restored. By early afternoon on 17th of December 1944, the encounter at the Baugnez crossroads had concluded with the surrender of the American column. The prisoners, drawn primarily from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, were disarmed and gathered in an open field adjacent to the road junction. Snow covered the ground, and the terrain offered little natural cover. The American prisoners were under guard by German personnel from Kampfgruppe Peiper, part of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. German armored vehicles, including tanks and half-tracks, continued to pass through the crossroads as the battle group pressed westward in accordance with its operational orders. The number of prisoners assembled in the field has been established through post-war investigations and survivor testimony as more than 80, including enlisted men and officers. The prisoners stood or sat in small clusters while German guards maintained watch. Weapons taken from the Americans had been removed, and no evidence indicates that the prisoners retained arms after surrender. During this period, Kampfgruppe Peiper was operating under significant time pressure. The German plan for the Ardennes offensive required rapid movement to seize key road junctions and fuel depots. Delays at roadblocks, traffic congestion, and resistance encountered earlier on 17 December had already slowed the advance. Fuel shortages were an ongoing concern. While the prisoners remained in the field, additional German vehicles arrived and departed. The situation remained fluid. Some German personnel later stated that confusion existed regarding the handling of prisoners during fast-moving operations, though no written orders authorizing the killing of prisoners have been produced. At some point after the prisoners had been assembled, gunfire began. Multiple survivor accounts state that German machine guns opened fire on the prisoners without warning. Small arms fire followed. The shooting was concentrated on the group in the field, striking men who were standing, kneeling, or attempting to lie flat on the ground. The firing was sustained rather than isolated. Prisoners were hit in rapid succession. Several were killed immediately. Others were wounded and fell. As the shooting continued, some American soldiers attempted to flee the field, running toward nearby hedgerows, ditches, and wooded areas. German personnel fired at prisoners who attempted to escape. Survivors later testified that they were pursued by gunfire as they ran across open ground. Some were struck and killed while fleeing. Others reached cover and continued moving away from the site. The duration of the shooting has been estimated by witnesses as lasting several minutes. When the firing stopped, the field contained numerous dead and wounded American soldiers. German forces did not provide medical aid to the wounded prisoners at the scene. Several American soldiers survived by feigning death. Survivor testimony consistently describes men lying motionless among the bodies until German forces departed. In some cases, wounded soldiers remained still despite injuries, waiting until darkness or the absence of German troops allowed movement. These individuals later escaped the area on foot. German units did not remain at the site for an extended period after the shooting. Kampfgruppe Peiper continued its westward movement, leaving the field and the bodies behind. The area remained under German control for a time, preventing immediate recovery of the dead by American forces. Survivors who escaped moved through snow-covered terrain under hazardous conditions. Some traveled for hours or days, avoiding German patrols and vehicles. Several eventually reached American lines and reported the incident to U.S. commanders. Initial survivor reports were delivered verbally and were fragmented, reflecting the conditions under which the men had escaped. Despite this, key elements were consistent. Prisoners had surrendered. They had been gathered in a field. German forces had opened fire on them. Survivors had escaped under fire. These reports reached U.S. Army headquarters during an ongoing crisis. The German offensive was still unfolding, and American units were engaged in defensive actions across the Ardennes. Immediate investigation of the site was not possible due to the tactical situation. In January 1945, after American forces regained control of the area around Baugnez, formal recovery and investigation began. U.S. Army personnel located the field where the prisoners had been held. Bodies were found in the positions described by survivors. The remains were examined and identified as American soldiers, captured on 17th December 1944. Many showed gunshot wounds consistent with close and medium-range fire. The positions of the bodies indicated that they had been struck while standing, kneeling, or lying on the ground, consistent with survivor accounts of the shooting sequence. Investigators documented the site with photographs, sketches, and written reports. The field was mapped. Shell casings and other physical evidence were collected where possible, though snow and time had affected the preservation of some material evidence. No evidence was found indicating that the prisoners had attempted to resist after surrender. No American weapons were recovered from the field. The condition and placement of the bodies supported the conclusion that the victims were unarmed at the time they were shot. The number of American soldiers killed at the site has been established as 84, based on recovered remains and identification records. This figure became the accepted casualty count associated with the incident. The killings at Baugnez were not immediately known to all U.S. units in the Ardennes, but as survivor reports spread, awareness increased. The incident contributed to heightened tension and fear among American troops, who were already facing a determined German offensive under severe winter conditions. The shooting of surrendered prisoners constituted a violation of the laws of war as understood and codified at the time. This classification was applied during post-war investigations and formed the basis for later prosecutions. At the operational level on 17 December 1944, Kampfgruppe Peiper continued its advance after leaving the site. The battle group encountered further resistance and logistical difficulties later that day, and in the days that followed, eventually becoming encircled and forced to abandon vehicles. For the American soldiers killed at Baugnez, those later developments lay beyond the moment of their capture. The sequence of events at the crossroads, from surrender to shooting, was reconstructed through survivor testimony, physical evidence recovered in January 1945, German unit identification, and subsequent judicial proceedings. These sources collectively established the factual record of what occurred. The killings at Baugnez became the central event referred to as the Malmedy massacre, named for the nearby town rather than the precise location of the field. The incident would later be examined in detail during U.S. Army war crimes investigations and trials. At the time of the shooting, however, the Ardennes battle continued to unfold. Commanders on both sides focused on immediate military objectives. The full significance of what had occurred at the crossroads would not be realized until weeks later, when the front stabilized and the dead were recovered. After the shooting at the Baugnez crossroads on 17 December 1944, a number of American soldiers remained alive in the field. Survival occurred through two primary circumstances: escape during the firing and concealment after it ended. These survivors became the initial sources for reports of the incident. Several prisoners fled when the shooting began. As German machine guns and small arms opened fire, some Americans ran from the field toward nearby ditches, hedgerows, and wooded ground. The terrain was open and snow-covered, offering limited concealment. German personnel fired at prisoners who attempted to escape, and several were killed while running. Despite this, a number of soldiers reached cover and continued moving away from the site. Other survivors remained in the field. Multiple accounts describe American soldiers falling to the ground when the firing started and remaining motionless among the dead and wounded after the shooting stopped. Some were wounded but did not move. Others were uninjured but remained still to avoid detection. These men waited until German forces departed the area before attempting to escape. German units did not remain at the site after the shooting. Kampfgruppe Peiper continued its westward advance, leaving the field and the bodies behind. The area remained under German control for a period, preventing immediate recovery or investigation by U.S. forces. Once German vehicles and personnel were no longer present, survivors began to leave the area individually or in small groups. Movement was slow and hazardous. Snow, cold temperatures, and unfamiliar terrain complicated escape. Survivors avoided roads and villages due to the presence of German patrols and advancing armored columns. Some survivors traveled for several hours before reaching cover. Others moved intermittently over the course of 1 or more days. Several accounts describe soldiers hiding during daylight and moving primarily at night to reduce the risk of detection. The first survivors reached American lines, Machimärens later on the 17th of December, and in the days immediately following. They reported the incident to officers at unit command posts and rear area headquarters. These initial reports were delivered verbally and varied in detail, reflecting the conditions under which the survivors had escaped. Despite variations in individual accounts, key elements were consistent. Survivors reported that American soldiers had surrendered near Malmedy, been gathered in a field, and then fired upon by German forces. They described machine gun fire, attempts to flee, and the presence of numerous dead in the field. These reports identified the location as a crossroads south of Malmedy. At the time these reports were received, U.S. forces in the Ardennes were under intense pressure. The German offensive was still advancing, and command attention focused on containing the breakthrough. Immediate investigation of the site was not possible due to the tactical situation. Nonetheless, the reports were taken seriously. Information about the killings moved upward through U.S. Army channels. Field commanders passed survivor accounts to higher headquarters. By late December 1944, senior U.S. officers in the Ardennes were aware that a mass killing of American prisoners had been reported. As the reports circulated, word of the incident spread among American units operating in the region. The killings contributed to heightened tension and fear, particularly among support and rear area units that faced the possibility of capture during the fluid fighting. Orders issued during this period emphasized vigilance and caution. American units were warned about the possibility of enemy forces killing prisoners. The incident became part of a broader understanding that the Ardennes fighting differed from earlier phases of the campaign in intensity and risk. The first opportunity to verify survivor accounts came in January 1945, after American forces pushed back the German advance and regained control of the area around Malmedy and Baugnez. Once the front stabilized and access became possible, U.S. and Army personnel returned to the reported location. Recovery teams located the field described by survivors. Bodies were found where the prisoners had been held. The positions and condition of the remains matched survivor descriptions of the shooting and subsequent attempts to escape. Identification of the dead was carried out using dog tags, unit records, and personal effects. The recovered remains were confirmed to be American soldiers captured on 17 December 1944, primarily from the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. Medical examinations documented gunshot wounds consistent with execution-style firing at close and medium range. The lack of defensive wounds or weapons at the site supported the conclusion that the victims were unarmed prisoners at the time they were shot. The recovery of the bodies provided physical confirmation of survivor reports. Photographs, sketches, and written documentation were produced as part of the investigation. This material formed the foundation for subsequent war crimes inquiries. Survivor testimony was recorded in detail once conditions allowed. Statements were taken under oath, and accounts were compared for consistency. These testimonies established timelines, locations, and descriptions of German personnel and equipment present at the site. The survivors' reports transformed the incident from battlefield rumor into a documented event. By early 1945, the killing of American prisoners near Malmedy was recognized as a confirmed violation of the laws of war. Responsibility for investigating and prosecuting those involved was assigned to U.S. Army War Crimes authorities. The accounts provided by survivors, combined with physical evidence recovered at the site, would later be presented during formal judicial proceedings. These materials formed the factual basis for charges brought against members of Kampfgruppe Piper and associated units. At the time the survivors first reported what had happened, however, the immediate priority remained the battle itself. The Ardennes fighting continued through late December and into January, delaying full investigation. The survivors of Baugnez played a central role in preserving the record of the incident. Without their escapes and testimony, the killings might not have been documented with the same level of detail or certainty. Their accounts ensured that the events of 17 December 1944 did not remain unrecorded. By late December 1944, reports of the killings near Malmedy had moved beyond isolated survivor accounts and into formal U.S. Army channels. The Ardennes offensive was still ongoing, but American forces had begun to stabilize the front and, in some sectors, push German units back. This change in the tactical situation made it possible to confirm what survivors had reported days earlier. Initial U.S. Army response focused on verification. Commanders in the Ardennes region received multiple independent reports describing the same event. American soldiers captured near Malmedy, gathered in a field, and shot by German forces. These reports came from different survivors who had reached American lines at different times and locations. Despite variations in individual detail, the core elements remained consistent across accounts. The location identified was the Baugnez crossroads, south of Malmedy, because the area remained under German control for several weeks following the incident. Immediate access was not possible. During this period, U.S. Army headquarters logged survivor statements and forwarded summaries up the chain of command. The reports reached 1st Army headquarters and were transmitted to higher-level Allied commands responsible for intelligence and legal matters. The situation changed in January 1945. As German forces withdrew from the area under pressure from Allied counterattacks, American units regained control of the Malmedy-Baugnez region. Once the area was secured, U.S. Army personnel were dispatched to locate the reported site of the killings and recover the bodies of the missing soldiers. Recovery teams arrived at the crossroads, and nearby fields identified in survivor testimony. The field described by survivors was located without difficulty. Snow still covered parts of the ground, but the positions of bodies were visible. American soldiers found numerous remains scattered across the field, consistent with accounts describing prisoners being shot in place and while attempting to flee. The recovery operation proceeded methodically. Bodies were photographed in situ before removal. Their positions were marked and recorded. U.S. Army personnel documented the orientation of the bodies, distances between them, and proximity to roads, ditches, and hedgerows. This documentation was intended to preserve the condition of the site for investigative and judicial purposes. Identification of the dead followed established procedures. Dog tags, personal effects, and unit records were used to identify the remains. Most of the bodies were identified as members of the 280th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, with a smaller number belonging to other U.S. units that had been traveling with the column on 17th December. Medical examinations were conducted. Army medical officers examined the remains to determine cause of death. The majority of victims showed gunshot wounds. Many wounds were consistent with small arms and machine gun fire at close or medium range. The examinations did not reveal evidence of combat injuries consistent with a firefight. No American weapons were found with the bodies. The physical evidence supported survivor accounts. The lack of weapons at the site, combined with the pattern and location of wounds, indicated that the victims had been unarmed at the time they were shot. The distribution of bodies across the field and along escape routes aligned with testimony describing prisoners being fired upon while standing together and while fleeing. The recovered remains were removed from the site and buried in temporary military cemeteries. Identification records were updated, and next-of-kin notifications were prepared through official channels. At the same time, the incident was formally classified as a suspected war crime. Responsibility for further investigation was transferred to U.S. Army War Crimes authorities. This included legal officers and investigators tasked with gathering evidence, identifying suspects, and preparing cases for prosecution after the conclusion of hostilities. Investigators began collecting statements. Survivors who had escaped the shooting were interviewed in detail. Statements were taken under oath when possible. Investigators recorded timelines, descriptions of German uniforms and vehicles, insignia observed, and any identifying information about the units involved. These interviews were conducted separately and later compared for consistency. German unit identification became a priority. Based on survivor testimony, vehicle markings, and the known movements of German forces on 17 December, investigators identified Kampfgruppe Peiper of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte, SS Adolf Hitler, as the unit present at Baugnez. This identification was corroborated by intelligence records tracking German movements during the opening days of the Ardennes offensive. The U.S. Army also collected battlefield reports and operational logs, captured German documents, and post-war interrogations of German prisoners were later used to reconstruct the movements of Kampfgruppe Peiper on 17 December. These materials helped establish which German elements were present in the area at the time of the killings. News of the confirmed killings spread rapidly through U.S. forces. American units operating in the Ardennes were informed that surrendered soldiers had been killed by German forces. This knowledge influenced troop behavior during the remainder of the battle, increasing tension and caution, particularly among units operating in exposed or rear areas. Despite the emotional impact, U.S. Army leadership emphasized maintaining discipline. Orders reminded troops that prisoners were still to be treated in accordance with the laws of war. Commanders were instructed to prevent reprisals and to report any violations immediately. These directives were issued to prevent the incident from triggering retaliatory actions that could undermine U.S. conduct and legal standing. By late January 1945, the recovery and initial investigation phase was complete. The site had been documented. The victims had been identified. Survivor testimony had been recorded. Responsibility for the killings had been provisionally assigned to specific German units. The case was now prepared for formal judicial proceedings, once conditions allowed. The Malmedy killings were no longer a battlefield rumor. They were a documented event, supported by physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and unit identification. This documentation ensured that the incident would be addressed after the war through formal legal mechanisms rather than remaining unresolved. As the Ardennes fighting concluded and Allied forces resumed their advance into Germany, attention shifted toward accountability. The evidence gathered in January 1945 would later form the foundation for one of the most significant war crimes trials conducted by the U.S. Army in Europe. For the families of the men killed near Malmedy, the recovery of the bodies provided confirmation of their fate. For the Army, it marked the transition from battlefield response to legal action. What followed would determine responsibility, individual culpability, and punishment. By February 1945, the U.S. Army had moved beyond battlefield recovery and into a formal investigative phase concerning the killings near Malmedy. With the Ardennes front stabilized and Allied forces advancing eastward, military authorities now had the time and access required to pursue accountability through established legal channels. Responsibility for the investigation was assigned to U.S. Army war crimes authorities operating in the European theater. These investigators were tasked with assembling a complete factual record of the incident at the Baugnez crossroads, identifying the German personnel involved, and preparing cases suitable for prosecution under the laws of war. The investigation relied on three primary sources of evidence. The first source was survivor testimony. American soldiers who had escaped the shooting on 17 December 1944 were located and formally interviewed. Statements were taken under oath where possible. Investigators recorded detailed timelines, descriptions of the surrender, the assembly of prisoners, the opening of fire, and the aftermath. Survivors were asked to identify German uniforms, insignia, vehicle markings, and spoken language to assist in unit identification. These statements were taken independently and later compared. Investigators noted that while individual accounts varied in minor detail, the central facts were consistent. The Americans had surrendered. They had been disarmed. They had been gathered in an open field. German forces had opened fire without provocation. Prisoners attempting to escape had been fired upon. These consistent elements formed the core narrative accepted by investigators. The second source of evidence was physical documentation from the site. Photographs taken during the January recovery operation were cataloged and preserved. Sketches of the field and surrounding terrain were prepared, showing the locations where bodies had been found. Medical examination reports describing gunshot wounds were included in the case file. Investigators emphasized the absence of American weapons at the site and the positioning of bodies as evidence that the victims had been unarmed prisoners. The third source of evidence involved German unit identification. U.S. intelligence officers reconstructed the movements of German forces during the opening days of the Ardennes offensive. Operational maps, intercepted communications, and captured documents were reviewed to determine which German units had passed through the Baugnez area on 17 December 1944. This reconstruction identified Kampfgruppe Peiper, a mobile battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, as the only German formation present at the crossroads at the time of the incident. The battle group's route, timing, and reported engagements matched survivor accounts and physical evidence from the site. Investigators also relied on captured German personnel. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, members of the 1st SS Panzer Division were captured and interrogated. Some provided information about the movements and actions of Kampfgruppe Peiper during the Ardennes offensive. These interrogations were conducted under military intelligence procedures and documented for later use. The investigation identified Joachim Peiper, commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper, as the senior officer responsible for the unit's actions on 17 December 1944. Additional officers and enlisted men within the battle group were also identified as present at or near the Baugnez crossroads. By mid-1945, the U.S. Army had assembled sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges. The legal framework for prosecution was established under military law and the recognized laws of war, which prohibited the killing of prisoners of war. The killings at Baugnez were classified as a war crime based on the surrender and disarmed status of the American soldiers. The decision was made to conduct a collective trial. Rather than prosecuting a single individual, U.S. POW authorities charged multiple members of Kampfgruppe Peiper who were alleged to have participated in, ordered, or failed to prevent the killings. This approach reflected the difficulty of assigning individual responsibility in a battlefield environment where orders, actions, and participation overlapped. Preparation for trial involved consolidating evidence. Survivor testimony, medical reports, photographs, site sketches, intelligence summaries, and interrogation records were organized into a comprehensive case file. Witness lists were prepared. Investigators worked to establish chains of command, determine who was present at the site, and assess who had authority over the prisoners at the time of the shooting. German defendants were informed of the charges. Those identified for prosecution were held in U.S. custody pending trial. Legal counsel arrangements were made in accordance with military tribunal procedures. Defendants were charged with violations of the laws and customs of war, specifically the murder of prisoners of war. The trial venue was selected as Dachau, where U.S. military tribunals were already operating. Dachau had been chosen as a central location for war crimes trials conducted by U.S. forces in the European theater. Throughout the preparation phase, U.S. Army authorities emphasized procedural documentation. The Malmedy case was recognized as significant due to the number of victims, the clarity of evidence, and the prominence of the German unit involved. Investigators were aware that the proceedings would be closely scrutinized and that the integrity of the process would be critical. At the same time, the broader war continued. Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945 and advanced rapidly into central Germany. German resistance collapsed in April. On 7th May 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. With hostilities ended, attention shifted fully to post-war accountability. Following the German surrender, preparations for the Malmedy trial accelerated. Witnesses were transported to testify. Evidence was finalized. Legal teams completed case preparation. The trial was scheduled to address not only the killings at Baugnez, but also other alleged war crimes committed by members of the 1st SS Panzer Division during the Ardennes offensive. By the time the proceedings were ready to begin, the Malmedy case had become one of the most thoroughly documented war crimes investigations conducted by the U.S. Army in Europe. The factual record established during the investigation phase would form the basis for courtroom testimony, verdicts, and sentencing. The focus would now shift from battlefield reconstruction to judicial determination of responsibility. The transition from investigation to trial marked the final stage in addressing the events of 17 December 1944 through formal legal means. In May 1946, the United States Army convened a military tribunal to adjudicate charges arising from the killings of American prisoners near Malmedy during the Ardennes offensive. The proceedings were held at Dachau, which had been designated by U.S. authorities as a central venue for war crimes trials in the European theater. The case brought before the tribunal addressed events that occurred on 17 December 1944 at the Baugnez crossroads, south of Malmedy, Belgium. The defendants were members of Kampfgruppe Peiper, a mobile battle group of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler, identified by U.S. investigators as the unit present at the site of the killings. A total of 74 German defendants were charged in the Malmedy case. The group included officers, non-commissioned officers, and enlisted men. Among the accused was Joachim Peiper, the commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper during the Ardennes offensive. Other defendants held various command and subordinate roles within the battle group. The charges alleged violations of the laws and customs of war, specifically the murder of prisoners of war who had surrendered and were unarmed. The prosecution's case encompassed the killings at Baugnez, as well as additional incidents involving prisoners and civilians attributed to the same German formation during the Ardennes campaign. The tribunal was composed of U.S. Army officers serving as judges. Proceedings were conducted under military law applicable to war crimes. The defendants were represented by defense counsel, including German lawyers, and appointed counsel operating under the tribunal's rules. The prosecution presented evidence drawn from multiple sources. Survivor testimony formed a central component of the case. American soldiers who had escaped the shooting at Baugnez testified under oath, describing the surrender, the assembly of prisoners in the field, the opening of fire by German forces, and their subsequent escape. These testimonies were consistent with statements collected during the wartime investigation. Physical evidence recovered from the site was also introduced. Photographs taken during the January 1945 recovery operation were presented to the tribunal. These images documented the field where the prisoners had been held and the positions in which bodies were found. Medical examination reports describing gunshot wounds were submitted, supporting the conclusion that the victims had been unarmed when shot. The prosecution further relied on German unit identification and operational records. Maps and intelligence summaries showed the movements of Kampfgruppe Peiper on 17 December 1944, placing the unit at the Baugnez crossroads at the relevant time. Captured German documents and post-war interrogations were used to establish command relationships and the presence of specific subunits in the area. Witnesses also testified regarding German procedures. Some testimony addressed the handling of prisoners during fast-moving armored operations and the absence of any lawful justification for killing surrendered personnel. No written orders authorizing the execution of prisoners were produced by the defense or prosecution. The defense challenged aspects of the prosecution's case. Defense counsel argued that responsibility could not be assigned clearly to individual defendants due to the confusion of battle, the rapid movement of units, and the difficulty of identifying who fired specific shots. Some defendants claimed they were not present at the field or had no control over the prisoners. Other defense arguments addressed interrogation methods used during the investigation phase. Defense counsel alleged that some confessions or statements obtained during U.S. custody were coerced. These claims became a focal point of later controversy surrounding the Malmedy trial, though they did not halt the proceedings at the time. The tribunal evaluated these claims within the framework of the evidence presented. After weeks of testimony, the court reached its verdicts in July 1946. Of the 74 defendants, 43 were sentenced to death by hanging, 22 received life imprisonment, and 8 received fixed-term prison sentences. One defendant was acquitted. Joachim Peiper was sentenced to death. The tribunal concluded that Peiper, as commander of Kampfgruppe Peiper, bore responsibility for the actions of his unit, including the killings of prisoners at Baugnez. The court found that he had failed to prevent or punish the crimes committed by his subordinates. Following the verdicts, the sentences were subject to mandatory review. Under U.S. military procedures, war crimes convictions and sentences required confirmation by higher authority. The Malmedy sentences were reviewed by senior U.S. military officials and legal authorities. During this review process, concerns were raised regarding the conduct of the investigation. Allegations of coercive interrogation methods prompted further examination. In 1948, the U.S. Army conducted a review of the Malmedy case, including hearings before a U.S. Senate subcommittee. These proceedings examined whether defendants' rights had been violated during the investigative phase. As a result of the review, some sentences were commuted. Several death sentences were reduced to life imprisonment or fixed terms. Joachim Peiper's death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Other defendants also received reduced sentences based on the findings of the review and subsequent clemency decisions. Over the following years, additional sentence reductions occurred. By the mid-1950s, many of the convicted defendants had been released from prison. Piper was released in 1956 after serving approximately 11 years in custody. Other defendants were released earlier or later depending on the final disposition of their sentences. The Malmedy trial remained one of the most prominent U.S. war crimes proceedings conducted after the Second World War. The case established judicial findings regarding the killings of American prisoners at Baugnez and affirmed that such actions constituted war crimes under international law. At the same time, the later review and commutation process became part of the historical record associated with the case. The trial concluded the formal legal response to the events of 17th of December 1944. Responsibility for the killings was adjudicated through military judicial procedures. The evidence assembled during wartime investigation and presented in court established a documented account of the surrender, shooting, and deaths of American prisoners near Malmedy. The verdicts and sentences marked the final stage in addressing the incident through legal means. What remained after the trial was the factual record, the capture of American soldiers, their killing after surrender, the identification of the German unit involved, and the judicial outcomes that followed. Following the verdicts delivered by the U.S. Military Tribunal at Dachau in July 1946, the Malmedy case entered a required post-trial review phase. Under U.S. Army legal procedures in effect at the time, sentences imposed by military tribunals for war crimes were not carried out immediately. All verdicts and sentences were subject to automatic review by higher military and governmental authorities. This review process began in late 1946. The initial confirmation authority for the Malmedy sentences was the Commanding General of the European Theater. Legal officers examined the trial record, including transcripts, evidence presented, and the conduct of the proceedings. This review assessed whether the trial had followed applicable procedures and whether the findings were supported by the evidence. During this period, defense counsel for the convicted German personnel submitted formal appeals. These appeals challenged aspects of the investigation and trial, particularly the methods used by U.S. Army interrogators during the pre-trial phase. Defense filings alleged that some confessions and statements had been obtained through coercion, including physical and psychological pressure, during detention and interrogation. As these allegations circulated, the Malmedy case began attracting attention beyond military legal circles. In 1948, concerns about interrogation practices reached the U.S. Congress. A subcommittee of the U.S. Senate initiated hearings to examine the conduct of U.S. Army war crimes investigations in Germany, including the Malmedy case. These hearings were chaired by Senator Raymond Baldwin. The Senate hearings did not retry the case. Instead, they focused on whether investigative methods used by U.S. personnel complied with U.S. standards and international obligations. Testimony was taken from U.S. Army investigators, legal officers, and other personnel involved in the Malmedy investigation. German defense counsel and representatives also presented information regarding interrogation conditions. The hearings documented that coercive interrogation techniques had been used in some war crimes investigations in the immediate post-war period. As a result of these findings, U.S. Army authorities initiated further internal reviews of the Malmedy case. These reviews did not overturn the tribunal's findings that killings had occurred at the Baugnez crossroads. The factual determination that American prisoners had been shot after surrender remained intact. However, the review process affected sentencing. In 1948 and 1949, U.S. military authorities recommended commutation of several death sentences imposed in the Malmedy case. These recommendations were based on procedural concerns related to interrogation practices rather than a reversal of the tribunal's conclusions regarding guilt. As a result, a number of death sentences were reduced to life imprisonment or fixed-term sentences. This included the sentence imposed on Joachim Peiper, whose death sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Other defendants also received reduced sentences, with some receiving terms ranging from 10 years to life. By the early 1950s, additional sentence reviews took place, changes in U.S. policy toward Germany, including efforts to stabilize and integrate the Federal Republic of Germany into Western defense structures during the early Cold War, influenced clemency decisions. Many German war crime sentences imposed immediately after the war were reviewed during this period. In the Malmedy case, further sentence reductions were approved. Defendants serving life sentences had their terms reduced to fixed periods. Those serving fixed terms received parole consideration. Releases occurred gradually over several years, rather than all at once. By 1956, the majority of defendants convicted in the Malmedy case had been released from custody. Joachim Peiper was released in December 1956 after serving approximately 11 years in prison. Other defendants were released earlier or later depending on individual sentence adjustments and parole decisions. The legal status of the Malmedy convictions remained unchanged. The commutations and releases did not constitute acquittals or reversals of the tribunal's findings. The convictions themselves were not overturned. The killings at Baugnez continued to be classified as war crimes under the laws of war. Following release, many former defendants returned to civilian life in Germany. Some remained involved in veterans organizations associated with former Waffen-SS personnel. Others lived privately. Peiper later relocated and worked in civilian employment before his death in 1976. From a U.S. Army perspective, the Malmedy case closed formally with the completion of sentence reviews and releases. No further prosecutions related to the incident were pursued by U.S. authorities after the final commutations. The case remained part of the official historical record of U.S. military tribunals conducted after World War II. The Malmedy massacre itself remained documented through multiple sources. These included survivor testimony, battlefield recovery reports, medical examinations, intelligence records, trial transcripts, and judicial findings. Together, these materials established a detailed factual account of events at the Baugnez crossroads on 17th of December 1944. The incident has since been included in U.S. Army historical studies of the Ardennes campaign and in official records concerning war crimes committed against American personnel during World War II. The recovery of the bodies, identification of the victims, and judicial proceedings ensured that the event was recorded formally rather than remaining anecdotal or unresolved. The final casualty count associated with the killings remained 84 American soldiers. Most were members of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, with others attached from different units traveling in the same column. Their names were recorded in U.S. Army casualty records, and they were later reinterred in permanent military cemeteries. The Malmedy massacre became one of the most widely cited incidents involving the killing of U.S. prisoners of war on the Western Front. It was referenced in post-war military education materials, legal discussions of command responsibility, and historical analyses of the Ardennes offensive. The case was also cited in discussions of post-war military justice and interrogation standards. By the end of the 1950s, all judicial proceedings related to the Malmedy case had concluded. The legal outcomes, including convictions, sentence commutations, and releases, represented the final actions taken by U.S. authorities in response to the incident. No additional trials or appeals altered the established findings. The documented sequence of events, from capture and killing through investigation, trial, and sentence review, formed a complete record. This record stands as the official account of what occurred near Malmedy during the Battle of the Bulge, and how those events were addressed through U.S. military justice procedures after the war. This channel documents World War II battles and incidents using verified records only. If you want the next case in this POW series, subscribe. Next episodes in order: Biscari Massacre, Sicily, July 1943 Chinon Incident. Ardennes, January 1945. Le Paradis, France, 1940. Leave a comment if you want the next section released immediately.